Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Congressional Western Caucus Forum. We've got one today titled Permitting Reform, Unleashing American Energy and the Path Forward. First off, I'd like to welcome my friend and colleague, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Bruce Westerman. Bruce, thank you for being with us. We are waiting for another colleague to come, Ms. Harriet Hageman from the great state of Wyoming, who is sitting in on a Judiciary Committee meeting for the time being, but will be joining us shortly. I also want to thank our witnesses for taking the time to be with us here today, with the goal of discussing the importance of permitting reform. And I know you all are very busy individuals, and thank you very much for taking the time to come to Washington, D.C. And just a few comments before we hear from you folks. I hear from my constituents recently on a near continuous basis, and I'm from the state of Washington. I represent Central Washington. And I also hear from, as chairman of the Western Caucus, from people around the country, particularly rural communities across America, that we literally need to cut the red tape and get the federal government out of the way of the American people. Our state and our local entities, we want to make improvements, the improvements that our country needs, yet they are constantly faced with burdensome regulations and delays in the permitting process that add time, adds money to already long and protracted, expensive projects. So it's either that, or I guess what I would characterize as frivolous lawsuits and litigation that is designed to halt projects literally in their tracks. At the same time, this current administration under President Biden continues to turn to foreign, and I might say sometimes adversarial nations for the energy and the resources that we need. Often it feels like the federal government does not want to invest in our own nation. For those of you that don't know, March is a lot of things, but one thing it is permitting month. You probably knew that, right? At least that's the way we call it here at the Western Caucus. Throughout this month, we highlight projects in all of our members' districts that demonstrate exactly why permitting reform is needed to unlock America's potential, from energy infrastructure to land management, conservation, and many, many more things. While millions of taxpayer dollars were recently allocated with the intent to upgrade our nation's crumbling infrastructure, that's all going to be for nothing unless we can find solutions to streamline the outdated and frankly out of control process and break ground. I'd like to give thanks to the House Natural Resources Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, as well as Chairman Westerman, Chairwoman Morris Rogers from my home state of Washington, and Congressman Graves for their leadership and their efforts in putting together H.R. 1, which is the Lower Energy Costs Act. It's truly an exciting time for us here in the Western Caucus. From oil to uranium to coal, many of the other things in between. Our panel of members come from districts with a vast array of resources and industries that unfortunately are all great examples of what we're talking about when we talk about being bogged down by red tape. Mr. Westerman, or one of my Western Caucus vice chairs from the state of Arkansas, serves, as I said, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. He represents a state that's rich in natural gas. Ms. Hageman, who we'll be seeing and hearing from soon from the state of Wyoming, she represents an extremely rich part of the United States. In fact, I believe Wyoming is the #1 uranium producer in the whole country. HR 1 would ensure that uranium would be classified as a critical mineral, allowing for extraction and refining of our own domestic supply. And that will strengthen our national security. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my friend, Mr. Bruce Westerman, the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee. Bruce?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to everyone for coming out today. And I just want to first off commend Dan and the job that he's doing with Western Caucus. You know, Western Caucus has always been a voice for rural issues. Last Congress, I was the ranking member and Dan was still the chairman. He was the chairman of the Western Caucus, and he did a phenomenal job of highlighting the issues with the Western Caucus, does a great job of having field trips and getting people out in rural America to see what's really happening out on the ground. So Dan and I are classmates and friends, and I'm just very appreciative of the work that he does. And as you all are quite aware, and as Dan mentioned, we do have a bill that's going to be on the floor next week called HR 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act. And first off, I want to congratulate our conference and stakeholders from sea to shining sea coming up with this legislation. This isn't something that just happened within a few weeks. We've worked on this for years. And Speaker McCarthy had the vision through the commitment to America to make some of our highest priorities American energy independence, the national security that comes along with that, to breaking supply chains from our adversaries. And when we look at HR 1, it checks a lot of boxes on the commitment to America, and that's why it ended up with the #1 bill coming out of the House. This was a statement by the Republican Party, by the majority, that this is the most important issue facing our country, and I will gladly argue that case. As we look at high inflation, as we look at national security, as we look at future economic development, it all starts with energy, and energy is more than natural gas, it's more than coal, it's more than oil, and all the things that come from oil. That's a huge part of it. It will continue to be a huge part of it for decades and decades and probably centuries to come. If you look at global consumption of energy by fuel source, coal, oil, and gas are still by far the dominant sources of energy. But there's a lot of new kinds of energy coming on the scene, and we want to be able to develop all of that energy. We want to be able to have the cleanest, the most affordable, and the most reliable energy in the world. And our ideas are that if you come up with the technology and the innovation to do that, then the developing countries are going to adopt that technology. Right now, we see developing countries that are building, China, for instance, built 38 gigawatts of coal power plants last year. We need to be figuring out how to make coal cleaner. We need to figure out how to make all fuels a cleaner source of energy, how to get more wind, how to get more solar, how to actually use the hydropower that we have in our country. I've been shocked to travel around. At one trip with Dan out to his area of Washington, we were on the Snake River at the Ice House Dam. So much water was flowing through that dam that you couldn't even hear somebody talk standing next to them. We go down inside the dam and there's 6 turbines and one of them's operating. So I asked the Corps of Engineers, why is only one turbine operating? They said, well, because we're being operated by a corridor. And also, we've found that our hydro plants that were built as baseload power are being operated as peaking power, because you have to have something to fill in the fluctuating gaps at the top of the energy curve, and hydro is one of those things that you can do that with. So as we put more wind and solar onto the grid, which is intermittent and it's an up and down input of energy, you have to be able to smooth that out. And we found that hydropower is being used for peaking power instead of baseload power. And I've seen that on hydro dams. in my district back home in Arkansas. So what I'm really excited about on the Lower Energy Cost Act is how with a conference-wide product, there are many, many members that have pieces of legislation that have come through 3 different committees that have been put into one big bill, HR 1, the Lower Energy Cost Act. On the Natural Resources Committee, we focused on 3 areas. We focused on energy on federal land and water, which includes everything from wind to solar to oil and gas, coal. We focus on something that has to be considered as synonymous with energy going forward, and that's mining. The estimators tell us that in the next 25 years, we have to mine as much copper as we've mined in the history of the world. That's a startling fact if we're going to meet the objectives that we have. We know how critical rare earth elements and critical minerals are to the future of our energy system. And what we're finding in America is we're not currently producing the energy that we're blessed with, and we're not mining the materials that we need to build the electric economy going forward. So we want to change that, and it's a huge benefit to the to Americans when that happens, because with the development of energy, with mining, and with the downstream refining and processing and manufacturing, I like to say we need to mine, we need to refine, and we need to manufacture, and that provides a huge economic benefit to our country when we do that. Right now, we are purchasing most of these materials from overseas, and when you look at where we're purchasing them from, China is dominating the world market, especially on mined products. Just to put that in perspective, in 1990 we produced more copper and steel than China. Today, they produce 10 times more copper and 11 times more steel. We have 2 copper smelters and they have 50. They are eating our lunch on minerals and elements, but it doesn't have to be that way because we are blessed with those things. The third part of the natural resources part of the Lower Energy Cost Act is NEPA reform, and this isn't gutting any kind of environmental laws. It's making the environmental laws work. It's giving people an opportunity to actually go through the permitting process, giving them an opportunity to actually build a project, whether that's a traditional energy extraction project or whether that's a new transmission power line or a wind farm or a solar farm. Everybody's facing the same problems with NEPA, and that is that NEPA is broken. And an example, it takes about 3 years to permit a mine in Canada, and it takes you measure in decades in the United States in permitting mines, and it just shouldn't be that way. We know we have a great record here on leading the world in environmental regulations and environmental quality, and we're continuing to improve that. And I challenge anybody to show me any place in the world where the eye of the public is more focused on the environmental stewardship of companies developing resources than right here in America, and show me some place in any place in the world where they do it better than we do it here in America. And I think you're going to spend a long time looking for those places because I'm not sure they're out there. So what Western Caucus is doing is very important. HR 1 is very important, and as you might expect, I have a ton of preparation to do for HR 1 since it's coming up next week, so I'm not going to be able to stay here for the whole meeting, Dan, but I sure wanted to come and support the Western Caucus and what you're doing, because you have supported so much what our whole Republican caucus and what people who care about rural issues are trying to do.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce, and to accommodate you, we will let you ask questions first if that helps. I will turn to Congresswoman Hageman as soon as she arrives. I want to just tell you, Bruce is the only, and I want to thank you for using that story from the state of Washington. It's a great illustration. Bruce is the only trained forester in all of Congress. And I got to tell you, this is the first time I've ever heard Bruce give a whole discussion without mentioning the word tree. Unless you got it in there and I just.
If you insist, Vigil will help our forest management tremendously too.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. So let's get to our panelists. I'd first like to recognize Mr. Randall Atkins. Mr. Atkins is the CEO, the founder, and the chairman, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Ramaco Resources. He's been involved in the energy-related investment and financing activity for 3.5 decades. He's on the board of directors of the National Mining Association and serves as the chairman of the National Coal Council. Mr. Atkins, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I need to press this. That work?
If the red light is on, you are.
I'm on. Okay, great. First, Chairman, thank you very much to meet with members of the Western Caucus to offer some observations on your proposed legislation and some of our own experience in the tribulations of permitting under current rules. I'm kind enough to give my background. My company is basically the fastest growing producing public company in the coal space in the United States at the moment. We produce predominantly metallurgic coal used for steel in the states of West Virginia and Virginia. We also own a large private coal reserve in Wyoming, which took us over 8 years to permit, that we are developing for a combination of coal and critical minerals, where we have been working for almost 5 years with 2 of the national labs from the Department of Energy on exploring various critical mineral possibilities there. We have a problem in this country, which I believe provisions of H.R. 1, such as the Coal Act, the Builder Act, and the Transparency and Production Act, will go a long way toward addressing. With over $6 trillion worth of mineral resources in the United States, including coal, it is essential that new and existing mining projects are permitted with clarity and absence of interference from national activist groups and in a time-limited fashion. We need this definition in order to maintain and expand our nation's and the world's ever-increasing mineral demand for electricity, infrastructure, and manufacturing. Indeed, the International Energy Agency estimates the demand for some minerals will grow by more than 40 times between now and 2040. As for coal's specific role, domestically in 22, thermal coal was the second largest energy source for U.S. electricity and will provide a similar percentage in the years preceding. Wyoming, as you noted, mines over 40% of the nation's overall coal production. Worldwide, coal use for electricity has seen a dramatic uptick this year in response to both strong demand and energy security concerns exacerbated by the Russian invasion. Metallurgic coal is the critical component for steel production, both domestically and overseas, and is indeed required for any form of energy transition involving renewables. At Ramaco, we have also been working for almost 10 years with the federal government on developing alternative, high-value, low-cost carbon products for coal, like carbon fiber, graphite, and graphene, which we feel could play a significant role in coal's future use as a transitional feedstock. Matching the speed and scale of increasing demand for minerals requires a permit process that allows mining companies to respond quickly to market signals. Current permit timelines inhibit that type of response. This places the U.S. not only at a competitive disadvantage, but encourages foreign dependence from unreliable sources such as China. Permitting delays for mining have been and continue to be the most significant risk to meeting domestic mineral production goals. Opening or expanding a mine in the U.S. typically involves multiple agencies, overlapping processes at the local, state, and federal levels. It also takes, as was noted, an average of 7 to 10 years to secure a mine permit, which is one of the longest processes in the world. The open-ended U.S. permit period is completely out of step with what was required to increase mineral production over the coming decades to supply new technologies and infrastructure. In our experience in Wyoming, the state regulators were professional and technically more than competent. However, out-of-state environmental activists by the name of Soros and Bloomberg funded the facade of local opposition to pursue 8 years of specious claims before we were granted a final permit by decision of the Wyoming Supreme Court. Legal standing allowing such groups to interfere must be dealt with. Valid concerns about environmental protection should always be considered. The permitting process, however, should not be used as a sword by out-of-state activists who are allowed to have standing to put mining projects in jeopardy, nor let projects wither on the vine without final decision. I should add that delays in the permitting process have not proven to create corresponding environmental benefits. In fact, the delays, uncertainty, and resulting high cost of permitting actually stifles investment in the U.S. because it instills a lack of confidence in any project's success. In conclusion, the policy recommendations suggested by the proposed H.R. 1 permit legislation are common sense changes that provide regulatory clarity to help the country meet an ever-increasing demand for minerals that our evolving world requires. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atkins. Appreciate that. Next, I would like to recognize Mr. J.C. Sandberg. J.C. is the Chief Advocacy Officer at the American Clean Power Association. He leads ACP's state and federal advocacy and regulatory policy work, as well as ACP's legal and research teams. Mr. Sandberg, welcome. We're very excited to have you with us today. You may proceed.
Chairman Newhouse, it's my privilege to be here, and thank you for having me. So as you said, I am the Chief Advocacy Officer at the American Clean Power Association, and ACP is a leading trade association in the clean energy space, and we have over 750 utilities, developers, manufacturers, purchasers, and transmission companies focused on deploying utility-scale clean energy, wind, solar, storage, and hydrogen. So as you know, clean energy is increasingly playing a bigger role in our nation's energy mix. Over 15% of the nation's power comes from wind and solar. Enough wind and solar, coupled with batteries, have been installed to power 59 million homes, and the clean energy industry is on the way to providing 500,000 American jobs. We are poised to see significant growth over the next decade with expanded investments in clean energy. These investments will create thousands more jobs, good-paying American jobs, while reducing energy costs, strengthening grid reliability, and improving our energy security. Key hurdles to the future development and deployment of domestic clean energy are the current federal permitting system and barriers to siting transmission lines, and I think that's why we're here today. The successful deployment of clean energy resources requires a predictable, timely, and cost-effective permitting framework. However, the current process is anything but. It takes an energy generation project, like a wind or solar farm, an average of 4.5 years to obtain necessary NEPA reviews. It also, for a transmission project, those delays could exceed more than a decade. These delays create uncertainty and raise project costs. There is also an opportunity cost. Money invested in a project waiting to break ground could be invested somewhere else, impeding employment opportunities and clean and affordable power for customers. Permitting challenges fall especially hard on energy production located on federal lands and waters. Although federal lands have the capacity to host a vastly larger number of clean energy projects than they currently do, the cumbersome federal permitting process makes it much more attractive to invest on private lands. For offshore wind, we are seeing significant delays due to an insufficient permitting and outdated approval process established nearly 2 decades ago. It is particularly important to highlight the overwhelming challenges to planning and siting interstate transmission lines. The current regulatory structure is not effective for integrating new sources of energy into the transmission grid. Addressing our permitting and transmission siting challenges at the federal level will be critical to the future development and deployment of domestic clean energy. ACP has been encouraged by ongoing efforts and various legislative proposals from both sides of the aisle to address these hurdles, including the Lower Energy Cost Act. H.R. 1 contains important provisions that would advance clean energy deployment in the U.S. by, among other things, putting clear timelines on NEPA reviews and eliminating requirements for duplicative environmental reviews and analysis. We also appreciate the provisions in this bill that seek to encourage domestic critical mineral production and establish an offshore wind revenue sharing structure for coastal states. Failure to enact critical permitting reforms and lift barriers that are hindering our ability to build clean energy infrastructure puts an estimated 100 gigawatts of clean energy projects and 150,000 American jobs at risk. ACP looks forward to continuing to work with the Western Caucus and Congress on these important issues. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sandberg. So different than what I had announced sooner, I'm going to turn to our third witness before we go to Ms. Hageman and listen to him. I'd like to introduce Mr. Tom Jordan. Mr. Jordan is the chairman and the CEO and the president of Coterra Energy. I believe he used to work as an executive vice president of exploration at Cimarex Energy, where he became CEO, president, and chairman in 2012. So, Mr. Jordan, thank you very much for being here. We're delighted to have you. You may have the floor.
Well, thank you, Chairman Newhouse. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here representing the American exploration and production industry. Although we're often unloved, we love our country. And our industry provides energy security, energy affordability, and the cleanest energy in the world, and the cleanest molecule of oil and gas in the world. And I'll address those in reverse order. Our industry is deeply committed to reducing emissions. It's a top engineering challenge. I'm a geophysicist and an engineer by background, and it is number one of priority not only in my office, but the offices of my peers, and we're making tremendous progress. As far as energy affordability goes, I don't have to tell you about the impact on the American consumer when energy prices are high. It's often a choice for a consumer between filling their car with gasoline or bringing cupcakes to their daughter's school. It's a tragic outcome that's unnecessary and made worse by really bad energy policy. And then finally, we provide energy security. And to that, it means not only source of stable supply, domestically produced, but it also means backstopping our allies around the world. Right now, the world is entering a period of polarization that we haven't seen in many decades, and American energy and the opportunity it provides to particularly help our allies in Europe, but also to evangelize American values and influence, is as high as it's been in my lifetime, and I hate to see us squander that opportunity. At Coterra, we have experience with the entire permitting process. We drill wells, and then we typically sell the product at the wellhead. So not only do we have exposure to the permit process on drilling a well, but we have exposure to the pipeline permitting process, the refining permitting process, the LNG export process, because if those permits don't get approved in a timely fashion, it backs up fully and we're exposed to it. We have assets in the Marcellus Shale of the Appalachian Basin, and to that, obviously, interstate pipelines and LNG export is a really critical issue. And then we're also in the Permian Basin and Anadarko Basin. And in the Permian Basin, particularly in New Mexico, we're exposed to federal permitting and the delays and entirely cumbersome process that it involves. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and also really appreciate H.R. 1 and what it attempts to solve. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Jordan, and all our witnesses for being here and sharing your thoughts on this very important issue. Now I want to turn to a very busy freshman member of Congress from the great state of Wyoming. I talked a little bit about her in my opening comments, but Ms. Harriet Hageman, would you share with us some of your thoughts, and then give you an opportunity to ask our witnesses some questions?
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, and I apologize for being late. I was in another committee hearing for the Constitution and Limited Government, and it was very interesting and starting to heat up. But it's wonderful to be here, and obviously You know what state I'm from, which is Wyoming, so you probably have an idea of what I'm going to say. I'm probably the biggest cheerleader there is for our energy industries for all of the reasons that you've said. I appreciate the work that you do. And what I often tell our energy companies is thank you for making our lives better, because that is what you do for every single person in this country. I was recently reading an article, it was called Why Modern Civilization Isn't Possible Without Fossil Fuels. And I'm just gonna read a couple of the statistics as to what fossil fuels do and why they're so important to the future of this country and frankly to the future of every country on planet Earth. Vaclav Smil, a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba, explains in his new book, quote, How the World Really Works, that modern societies require 4 pillars of civilization: cement, steel, plastics, and ammonia. Ammonia is the basis for all nitrogen fertilizers, and without the food produced with modern fertilizers, billions of people would starve. Plastics are found in everything from computers to furniture to clothes, and Smil explains in his book they are also indispensable in nearly every aspect of healthcare, from incubators to artificial hearts. Without steel, there would be no skyscrapers, no cars, including electric vehicles. And cement is the key ingredient in concrete, without which there are no modern cities, tunnels, dams, roads, runways, or ports. There are no viable replacements for these materials, at least not at this time, and not in the near future. A couple of other points made is that after the Ukraine invasion cut Europe off from Russian oil and gas, European industry began to suffer. Last month, Reuters reported that Germany industry is paying 40% more for energy this year than in 2021. Bloomberg reported in December that Britain's ceramics industries were facing a tenfold increase in energy prices and may have to shut down. And in Britain, they are telling people that they should stop bathing or they should shower with a friend. Now that might seem kind of funny, but that is the point of where we are. We're living in a modern society and returning almost to prehistoric times or pre-industrial times. A couple other things is I would say is that Americans are suffering through high inflation, foreign energy dependence, and energy poverty. Biden administration continues to disengage with our interests, all in the name of pursuing a radical, unrealistic, unachievable, and draconian Green New Deal agenda. And these efforts have prevented America from unleashing our domestic energy potential, resulting in a more faulty, unreliable energy grid, higher costs, and a worse standard of living. I am especially proud of H.R. 1, as I believe that this is the first step in unlocking our domestic energy supply. By getting rid of duplicative rules and securing the rights of small businesses, the Lower Energy Costs Act expedites the permitting process and prevents predatory environmental groups from cheating the system, requiring them to address their grievances with projects up front rather than after a 10-year standby. I am especially proud of the provisions in the legislation that address American coal production, including my Coal Act. Coal is one of the cheapest and most reliable forms of energy, and Wyoming is a coal state. Over 40% of the coal produced in the United States comes from the state of Wyoming, and H.R. 1 would ensure that previously awarded coal leases are to be granted approval upon passage of the bill. This is essential for Wyoming communities. It's essential for the future of this country. It's essential for our standard of living and for future generations. Again, we very much appreciate what you do. We want to support you here in Congress with the passage of H.R. 1. We appreciate your expertise and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Egerman. That's spot on comments. I like your analogy that we're headed into a pre-industrialization age almost. So many different things that we depend on these products for. If you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, I would allow you to go first.
I would love to ask Mr. Atkins. I think that you've experienced firsthand the frustrations of duplicated processes when trying to obtain a permit for coal projects, including your coal reserve in Wyoming, which took over 8 years to permit. Can you speak to what that process has looked like for you?
Well, it was, first of all, delighted to be here representing Wyoming and speaking with you. The process was like being caught in a maze with very high bushes. We found ourselves basically facing opposition from out-of-state environmental groups that were funding local, I call it facades of opposition, which took us down multiple regulatory and litigation paths before we were finally able to secure a permit courtesy of the Wyoming Supreme Court. But the experience was one that I can assure you many coal groups and many other types of energy groups would not have pursued. They would have simply given up at some point along the way. And I'm afraid that's what occurs, I think, to a large majority of energy projects these days because of permitting.
Well, and Mr. Jordan, you were just briefly visiting or talking about some of the permitting issues that you've dealt with as well. When you talk about Mr. Atkins' experience and yours, one of my concerns is that eventually the capital for these projects is going to dry up because they start becoming more precarious with each passing month and each passing year. And I really am concerned that we're eventually going to end up one day and we're not going to be able to manufacture our steel or our concrete or the plastics that we need to, again, live in a modern society. In terms of your experience in that regard, do you think limiting the amount of litigation or limiting the time frame within which people can file litigation or lawsuits against these projects, do you think that would help?
I think it's critical and central to a lot of the problems with American infrastructure. We and our assets in Northeast Pennsylvania, that's part of the country that's hidebound without additional pipelines. You know, it's been legendary. There's been some major pipelines killed. Our opponents are really, really astute of using the federal courts. They've realized they don't have to block the entire project. They just have to block 1 mile of it, and they can therefore kill the entire pipeline. I will just give you a personal story. We formed our company through a merger of a Permian company with a Pennsylvania company, and I came from the Permian company, so I was kind of a babe in the woods when it came to some of these issues. And with the conversation post-Ukrainian invasion, there's been kind of a reawakening awareness of the importance of oil and natural gas, at least over the next few decades. I called CEOs of pipeline companies to see if we could reopen the conversation around some regional pipelines. And I was told, absolutely not. They had lost so much money and put so many hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars down, thinking that they had a fair way of completion, and then projects were stopped in the court. It's critical to our sector. It's critical to all three of us here that we need to have clarity or we will not make these capital investments. NEPA reform is critical.
And Mr. Sandberg, just very quickly with you, would you agree that certainty and stability are two of the most important things in terms of permitting timelines and being able to move forward with your projects?
We would, and in fact, to kind of build on what he was saying, I think capital is patient, but it's not endlessly patient. And as you know, when you start to develop these projects and they get large enough, there are very few entities that can balance sheet that or carry that for a period of years. And so we're starting to see that for transmission projects, there are just a handful of players that can do that, and others won't even enter the market because even if they have the land or the right-of-way for a project, just the sheer length of the permitting process, being tied up in courts, federal, state, sometimes local control, it just becomes an untenable situation. And so there are many provisions in HR 1 that I think would help us to move that process forward.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good. Thank you very much, Harriet. Mr. Jordan, I've been to some of the gas wells in Pennsylvania, seen firsthand some of the challenges and some of the great work that's being done there. I understand that for this year, one of Coterra's top priorities is securing rigs and crews. So flexibility is important, but it's tough to predict commodity prices, tough to predict inflation rates. You started down this path, but could you touch upon how lags and delays impact, as it relates to permits, your company's ability to plan for the future?
Well, thank you for that question because it's a big issue. You know, one of the consequences in our business with insufficient infrastructure is that the commodity price swings wildly. For example, we've seen oil swing from, cresting $100 in oil per barrel to 70, 60s. We've seen natural gas go from $6, $7 a thousand cubic feet down to $2.14 this morning. And that means it's very, very difficult to plan. A lot of the services that we require, drilling rigs, frac crews, require long-term contracts. A lot of the transport agreements to put your molecules and secure them to flow in pipelines require long-term commitments. And it's exceedingly difficult to make those kind of long-term commitments in a volatile environment. One of the things additional infrastructure would do for us, and this is where permitting reform is so essential, additional infrastructure would stabilize our price environment to allow us to do more fulsome long-term planning and really plan our business in a way that lowers our costs and increases the confidence that the consumer has that they can also enter into long-term purchase agreements.
Right. So the permitting uncertainty compounds the problem.
Permitting causes the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Atkins, you talked about your interest in I think you called it the intersection of critical mineral mining and conventional coal mining. So looking forward, there might be permitting issues with dual commodity situations. How would the common sense streamlining provisions included in HR 1 help with the merging of conventional coal mining and critical mineral mining?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example. Out in Wyoming, we discovered in working with the national labs that our mine may contain meaningful deposits of rare earth concentrates. And so in order to permit that, we needed clarity on being able to have a coal permit, but also to overlay to mine, in this case, the clays that are above and below the coal seams. So these types of changes that you're proposing would dramatically streamline the ability to get one permit to take advantage of essentially mining more than one mineral.
Very good, very good.
And indeed, I would add, China basically is able to get most of their rare earth production from clays as opposed to actually hard minerals. So it's an interesting paradigm that might impact the coal industry on a long-term basis.
We could possibly have that same advantage. Interesting. Mr. Sandberg, as you know, many renewable energy products take, I think you mentioned, an average 4.5 years to obtain the necessary NEPA reviews. Transmission projects can take even longer, 6.5 years perhaps. You state that these delays are largely due to procedural inefficiencies in implementation rather than issues with NEPA itself. I think that's how I understood. So aside from what I would call common sense reforms to NEPA implemented in HR 1, are there other things that could be done to address the procedural inefficiencies?
I think that HR 1 takes a big step in that direction. I think that kind of giving enhanced authority to lead agencies is important. Just as an example, in the infrastructure bill that was passed in 21 now, right?
Yeah.
It's been a while. DOE is delegated to FERC some authority, and so DOE does the job, and FERC would have to do them the same job. And then if FERC now wants to hand it back to DOE, that also requires another process. And so it's just, I think we could all switch chairs and say the same thing. I think that the federal process is broken, and I think that 6.5 years I feel like is generous. If you talk to our members building that transmission, they tell you it's 10 years or 15 years. And some of them, the big ones, have been carrying that stuff on their balance sheet for that long. And as the Congresswoman said, at some point, people just stop doing it, right? And as Mr. Jordan said, there's hundreds of millions of dollars invested, and that just is essentially, it's ineffective, right? It's not going anywhere. It's written down or it's sold at pennies on the dollar, that the hope that someone else can come in and be more patient to do the project. And so I think HR 1, with some of the streamlining provisions, and some of the kind of enhancing delegated authority and some of those things can be really, really impactful.
And like you said, that those investments are patient, but not, the patience is not limitless.
It's not endlessly patient.
Endlessly patient. Well, gosh, you have any comments you'd like to make?
Just one more comment that I would like to make that I think is a follow-up on the point that you just said, which is that I have been a water and natural resource attorney for 25 years. And in Wyoming, I have worked on a lot of the big federal projects representing the irrigation districts or the municipalities that have received water, whether it's from Buffalo Bill or Pathfinder or Seminole or whatever one it might be. Those projects were constructed over 100 years ago. The Pathfinder was the very first one permitted under the 1902 Reclamation Act. Buffalo Bill was the very first one ever built under the 1902 Reclamation Act. When you go back and you look at the history of those projects, you realize that our forefathers, the visionaries associated with those, they weren't building those projects for themselves. They were building them for us. So that 100 and 120 and 130, and if we maintain them well, maybe 150 or 160 or even longer, years down the road, we will still have the benefit of those projects. What I'm always asking myself is, what are we leaving the next generation? And when you talk about this Byzantine, very complicated permitting process that eventually chases the capital away to do those visionary things, even just building pipelines or building the infrastructure to provide wind power or the transmission or the coal mines, what I realize is 20 years from now we're going to wake up and the people that are around at that time are going to say, what the hell did they leave for us? Because it's going to be a mess. And I think that's really a message that we need to be sending. We have to be continuously producing and preparing and building and constructing. Our forefathers did it for us and given us a standard of living that's unrivaled in world history. In order to maintain that, we're going to have to continue doing the same things. And so I appreciate your patience in being involved in these kinds of projects and your willingness to come here and testify about them.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Hageman. Mr. Jordan, Mr. Sandberg, Mr. Atkins, thank you all for being here. You've lent a great deal of information and confirmation to the goals of HR 1. I want to thank you for that. This truly is an issue of not only American energy independence, but American national security. And so thank you for helping to elevate this issue, to educate people about the importance of it. Just delighted and appreciative of your attendance here today and helping us with this effort. So thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That concludes the hearing. Appreciate it very much.